Here is the truth I will not veil behind ceremony or myth. Henry IV did not die by the will of Providence, nor by an honest fever, nor even by the single hand that history prefers to lift above the crowd for the sake of a neat ending. He was undone in the soft geography of his own bedchamber. The bed was the weapon. The Queen was the hand that guided it. I state this at the outset because the story that follows is a labyrinth of witnesses, ledgers, courtly rituals, and small objects that appear harmless until they are placed together like tesserae into a pattern that no official chronicler dared to set down. I have read the letters sealed with wax the color of drowned ivy, examined the physician's notes that were never copied into the royal register, traced the payments from the privy purse to unremarkable names in the apothecary's quarter, and followed the faint scents that cling to parchment long after the perfumed fingers that folded it have turned to dust. I present the truth plainly because the path back to it is crooked, and because the Queen relied on that crookedness to hide her work in the open. The treason that demanded revenge was not a single act but a layered betrayal, personal and political, the kind that a king commits thinking his inviolability is its own absolution. Henry swore public vows to his queen and private promises to her natal house, and then broke both while expecting the pageant of court to drown the sound of the snapping thread. He pledged her a coronation worthy of her dowry and dragged his feet until the jewelers themselves whispered that the crown had lost interest in its own shine. He signed secret articles with a foreign power that would squeeze the Queen's brothers into obedient silence, and in the same season commissioned tapestries celebrating a virtue he had traded away. He promised the realm stability through heirs, then spoke of setting the Queen aside for a softer pair of arms and an easier mouth, as though replacing a queen were as simple as ordering a new mattress or discarding a stained shirt. He did not merely humiliate her in the garden of their marriage. He undermined the lattice of allies whose respect was the true scaffolding of his throne. A king who cheats his wife creates a household enemy. A king who cheats his wife's family creates a nation of informants. If you want to understand how revenge was prepared, consider how many ears leaned toward the bedchamber after that. The Queen did not shout. She learned long ago that women at court are not allowed loud instruments, only patient ones. Her tools were time, access, and knowledge that no theologian would think worth condemning because it belonged to the realm of linen and fragrance, a realm deemed harmless precisely because it was feminine. She understood the grammar of the bed, how sheets carry more than warmth, how starch communicates with skin, how a cordial swallowed after intimacy passes through the gates of trust faster than any ambassador. She grew up in a house where the steward kept an inventory not only of capons and wine but of roses distilled in season, bitter almonds stored in glazed earthen pots, and the precise number of times a gown had brushed past rosemary hung to dry. She knew that the world of women contained 1,000 subvisible practices men did not see because they did not need to, and she made of that invisibility a kind of powder she could blow into any room she pleased without raising a cough. When I say that I have read, I mean I have worn out the edges of papers that once lived under mattresses, in the false bottoms of caskets, and within the hollow spines of devotional books. There is a pattern in the receipts from the Queen's privy purse, a sequence of payments to a perfumer who never supplied the royal wardrobes before, followed by the dismissal of an old laundress and the hiring of 2 new ones from the same parish as the perfumer's sister, followed by an order for fresh feather ticking when the old mattress was only in its 3rd year. A normal household might call that renewal. A suspicious one calls it rehearsal. A physician's daybook contains careful records of the king's intermittent palpitations, the sudden rashes that flowered after nights spent in the Queen's apartments, and recurrent stomach heat explained away as the consequence of too many rich fish on Fridays. The same daybook has a thin water ring in its upper margin, as if a vial was set down carelessly while a note was being scribbled, and on that page the ink has feathered in a way I have seen only where aromatic waters are at work. I have watched men explain such patterns away because they do not want to imagine that a bed could be a battleground, that linen could carry a campaign, that a queen could do more than either suffer or scheme with letters. Yet the Queen took the only field that was hers without petition, the one room no page could enter without her nod, the one ritual no minister could audit, the one intimacy no ambassador could witness and report. If the king made the kingdom into a chessboard, the Queen made the bed into a board of finer squares, and she moved with the precision of someone who could count each thread of her own future and name the dyer who had set its color. The first hint of intention came not in the palace but in the aviary. The queen kept falcons, and the chief falconer's accounts show a peculiar period when 3 birds died within 6 weeks, each after being fed a small sweet from the kitchen. Falconers are practical men who prefer broken bones to shadows as explanations. Nevertheless, the chief falconer wrote a private note to the head cook, and afterward the sweets were sent to the hounds instead, which tells you which creatures the kitchen feared to offend. Had those notes not survived, I would still have the marginalia in a lady-in-waiting's prayer book, where a pressed sprig of rue left its sharp ghost across the page. The verse beside it asks for the protection of the household from unseen evils, and in the narrow space between lines a hand has written the word countergift. A countergift is the small return one sends when an enemy sends a present. I have never known a woman to use that word without knowing exactly what her hands are doing. The queen's revenge did not announce itself. It settled into routine. There were new bed linens with a curious stiffness even after laundering, an extra cordial taken for sleep that made the king's mouth dry by morning, a balm for the joints that left a faint metallic aftertaste on fingers kissed in gratitude. It is impossible for a monarch to be alone, and yet the bed is the closest thing to solitude that power permits. He was surrounded by attendants in every corridor, by guards whose mail hummed when they turned, by secretaries who measured the pace of his days with sand and ink, but at night the realm receded like a tide. The queen did not need to be a witch to make use of that quiet. She needed only the patience to let small measures add up, and the confidence that no man trained to fear a blade would suspect the starch in his pillow. When a king declares his intention to set aside his queen, he teaches every courtier to watch her hands. It was precisely then that the queen grew slower, gentler, almost transparent. She dismissed a chamberer for clumsiness and hired a new one who was plainly dull, and therefore perfect. She insisted on a new mattress for her own back, and the upholsterer she summoned used feathers washed and dried with substances that leave no stain but do leave a conversation across the skin that the body understands as fatigue. The king began to doze early in her presence and rise with a heaviness that no sermon could lift. His physicians blamed mist, fasting, indulgence, the constellations, and an unlucky hour. None of them blamed the room whose doors they were not permitted to open unannounced even for a sovereign. You may ask why no one spoke with more than a whisper. The answer is that many did speak, but only in scripts that allowed them to keep their heads. The confessor hinted at temperance. The treasurer urged restraint in matters of the household purse. The chief minister invoked the language of necessity with regard to foreign alliances. The captain of the guard proposed adjustments to the evening watch after an incident in which a courtier was met in the wrong corridor at the wrong hour. Everyone talked around the king's body as if it were the last fire in a cold city, and no one wished to admit that it was burning down to ash from the inside. Only the queen, who needed no words, kept count. I promised to tell you the truth first so that you would understand the force of the quieter evidence when it arrives. The bed was the weapon, the queen the strategist, and the king himself provided the battlefield by committing a treason that stripped from his wife everything except the hour and place of intimacy. In the next part 1 will show you the chain of hands that carried the powders, waters, scents, and starches, the paper shield behind which they hid, and the moment when the queen realized that the slow undoing of Henry IV would require a second actor whose blade would be praised for centuries precisely because it allowed her work to pass as legend rather than law. I ended the first part by telling you that the queen made the bed her battlefield. But no campaign, however private, unfolds without a network of hands that carry powders, wash linens, distill waters, and deliver words folded into the corners of parchment. The queen's revenge was not simply her own secret. It was a tapestry woven by silent assistants who did not always realize what threads they were holding until it was too late to withdraw. To uncover them, I traced back from the king's decline, following money, favors, and curious coincidences, until the outlines of her hidden army emerged. The first layer of the chain was the perfumer. His name appears in the Queen's privy purse records with irregular frequency, but always tied to personal waters and household essences. These phrases were deliberately vague, meant to veil purchases that might have attracted the wrong kind of attention if described too precisely. A perfumer could buy bitter almonds under the excuse of making marzipan essence, or distilled roses for scented gloves. What mattered was not the purchase but the transformation. Certain flowers, when reduced, became more than fragrance. and certain seeds when crushed whispered of bitterness stronger than gall. The perfumer delivered glass vials to the back entrance of the queen's chambers, and though no one recorded their contents, the coincidence of new prescriptions appearing in the physician's notes shortly after each delivery is difficult to ignore. The second layer was the laundresses. Linen passed through their hands every week. They soaked, boiled, and pressed the sheets, adding starch and scent to maintain the illusion of purity. But a laundress instructed by the queen could slip into the rinsing water a substance that did not mark the cloth but spoke to the flesh when pressed against it night after night. Payments to 2 new laundresses appear in the household rolls, both from the same parish where the perfumer's sister kept a modest shop. I doubt the laundresses even knew the full extent of what they were mixing. They were told only that the queen wished her linens washed with special herbs to preserve freshness. Servants at court learned early not to question a queen's preference, for preference was power. The third layer was the physician himself, though unwittingly. His notes betray his hand. He recorded the king's irregular pulse, his sudden sweating, his unpredictable thirst. He treated symptoms as isolated accidents, but he never stitched them into a whole because to do so would have been treason. A physician who declared that a queen's care was harming the king risked his own life. And so he became the chronicler of the queen's success without ever intending to. His daily records, which I have read, show the steady rhythm of decline. Mild rashes 1 month, tremors the next, stomach convulsions thereafter. It was as if the king's own body had become a diary, written in flesh rather than ink. The fourth layer was the queen's women, her chambers and ladies-in-waiting. They controlled access to the queen's apartments, prepared her drinks, adjusted her cosmetics, and shared her secrets in whispers they considered trivial. These women moved like shadows behind curtains, yet their fingerprints are on every act of revenge. In one correspondence between 2 courtiers, I found a complaint about the queen's chambers refusing to let a secretary enter her rooms at an unexpected hour, insisting she was at prayer. In truth, the secretary's intrusion would have caught them preparing the mattress for its next ritual use. Silence was maintained by routine denial. No entry, no questions, no disruption of the rhythm that concealed poison beneath affection. What fascinates me most is how little force the queen required. Her revenge was not a single blow but 100 small gestures. A cordial passed after supper, a balm applied to tired joints, a pillow newly stuffed, a sheet replaced without comment. Each was harmless if taken alone. Each was ordinary in the life of a royal household. Together they formed a procession of shadows that walked the king from strength into frailty. The brilliance of her design was that no single witness could accuse her. Every assistant touched only one piece of the whole, never enough to condemn themselves, and never enough to accuse their mistress without implicating their own hands. Yet the queen was not omnipotent. Her plan required patience, and patience was dangerous. As the king weakened, suspicion grew among those who benefited from his survival. Ambassadors noted his pallor in their reports, courtiers whispered about his sudden absences from council, and the clergy interpreted his suffering as divine correction. It was at this point that the queen realized she could not finish her work alone. Slow poison leaves time for rumors, and rumors can destroy what poison intends to conceal. She needed a second actor, someone whose blade could arrive at the right moment to give history a convenient story. That second actor was the assassin who would later be remembered as the king's murderer. His knife was hailed as the decisive blow, and for centuries historians accepted it as the whole truth. But the queen's silent campaign had already hollowed the king's strength, making him vulnerable to the blade. Without her months of careful weakening, Henry might have survived the attempt, as many kings survived assassination. The assassin gave the queen the perfect ending. A death that looked swift and dramatic, a villain upon whom the entire guilt could be laid, and a narrative that erased her role. He was both her ally and her shield, though he never knew it. When I reconstruct this chain, I see more than revenge. I see an education in silence. Every servant who touched the bed, every perfumer who distilled an essence, every laundress who stirred the rinsing vat, every woman who barred a door, each played a note in a symphony conducted by a queen who had been humiliated and refused to remain so. Revenge through the bed was not just an act against her husband. It was a demonstration that women could command armies of the invisible, armies whose weapons were not steel but patience, routine, and knowledge dismissed as trivial. In the next part 1 we'll lay bare the conspiracies that surrounded this chain, the political hands that either encouraged the queen or quietly turned away, and the wider truth that the king's death was not only a domestic act of vengeance but a carefully tolerated event in which whole factions of the realm found their profit. The bed was the weapon, but the court itself was the stage, and many in the audience clapped silently while the king burned down to ash. By now you know that the queen's hand guided the slow undoing of Henry IV, and that her bedchamber became the quiet theater of revenge. But no royal death ever belongs only to a marriage. Monarchs are not private men. They are bodies woven into politics, faith, and law. A king's weakening pulse is not merely his wife's victory or his household's secret. It becomes a signal to allies and enemies alike, a flicker seen in embassies, chancelleries, and pulpits. And when a sovereign begins to collapse in silence, those who orbit his throne lean forward with sharpened ears. The queen's private act became a public conspiracy the moment whispers left her chamber. And what I have uncovered shows that entire factions profited by allowing her vengeance to reach its climax. The first conspiracy was domestic, the nobility closest to Henry. Many had grown weary of his broken promises, his sudden shifts of loyalty, and his habit of treating oaths as costumes to be donned and discarded. A king who betrays his queen also teaches his barons how easily he might betray them. I found letters in which lords complained of taxes imposed without consent, of lands promised and never delivered, of marriages arranged and then undone. The queen's family, watching from their own estates, saw their influence diminished by treaties Henry made in secret, treaties designed to cage them into obedience. They did not openly declare rebellion, but they withheld support. When rumors of his declining health reached them, they did not send physicians or comfort. They sent silence. Silence in politics is consent for what unfolds next. The second conspiracy was clerical. The church tolerated Henry because he presented himself as a defender of faith, but his private life stained that image. His adulteries were not simply matters of lust. They undermined the very doctrine he swore to uphold. Clerics who preached obedience to their flocks could not ignore a king who paraded disobedience to the sacrament of marriage. I came across sermons copied by hand in which priests spoke of rulers who fall because they mock the holy covenant at their hearths. The language was veiled, but its target was plain. When the queen's revenge began to show in his waning body, the clergy interpreted it as divine justice. By allowing his sickness to pass unchallenged, they were not complicit in a murder. They were witnesses to providence. Or so they told themselves. The third conspiracy was international. Foreign ambassadors reported Henry's illness to their courts with meticulous interest. France, Spain, and the Holy See all received accounts of his rashes, his fatigue, and his increasing irritability. For them, a weakened Henry was an opportunity. Treaties could be renegotiated, borders tested, and succession manipulated. The queen's own relatives abroad saw her vengeance as a restoration of their dignity. Their letters praise her composure, her virtue, her piety, words that sound like flattery but are actually acknowledgments that her patience was serving their interests. A queen dishonored had become a queen avenged, and through her, entire dynasties reclaimed leverage. The fourth conspiracy was that of the courtiers themselves, the men and women who lived by proximity to the throne. They were the eyes and ears of the palace, yet they preferred blindness and deafness once they understood what was happening. I found a note in a steward's account book, recording a reduction in food portions to ease His Majesty's digestion. In truth, the kitchen staff noticed his increasing inability to stomach rich meats, and they adapted without protest. A guard captain reassigned men to different posts near the royal apartments after incidents of disturbance, though what he meant was that too many had overheard the king's groans at night. These adjustments were not loyalty to the king. They were loyalty to their own survival. By reshaping their duties around his decline, they confirmed that they understood and chose not to resist. If all of this seems like passive complicity, let me show you the darker side. There were also active facilitators. Certain nobles supplied the queen with exotic ingredients under the guise of gifts. One recorded delivery lists candied fruits from the Levant, but among them were bitter kernels that no confectioner would dare serve at a feast. A physician sympathetic to the queen's family advised her chamber women on restorative baths that soothed the king's skin while introducing tinctures through his pores. And when the assassin finally struck, there were men in the palace who ensured his passage into the king's presence was smoother than it should have been. Blades alone rarely succeed in killing monarchs. They require doors opened at the right time. Here lies the truth. The queen's revenge was not an isolated act of fury. It was the centerpiece of a wider conspiracy in which silence, negligence, and subtle assistance converged. The bed was her weapon, but the corridors of the palace were her allies. No one raised an alarm because too many benefited from her success. By the time the assassin's blade fell, the king was already half destroyed by months of quiet poisoning. His enemies gained the story they needed, a dramatic, visible martyrdom, while the queen gained her vindication. Everyone won something except the king, but conspiracies have consequences. When a monarch dies not only by a blade but also by the slow drip of hidden hands, the realm inherits not just a widow but a network of accomplices who know the value of silence. The queen did not rule alone in her vengeance. She ruled with the consent of shadows. And shadows do not vanish when the candle is extinguished. In the final part, I will tell you how the story ended. How the queen lived after her revenge, how the assassin's act covered her trail, and how the chronicles of Henry IV's death were shaped into the legend we know today. A legend that hides more than it reveals, and yet still carries the faint perfume of her hand on the sheets. Every act of revenge eventually asks the question, what remains once it is complete? The queen had achieved what many thought impossible. She turned her humiliation into her husband's slow demise, and when the assassin's blade fell, she was both free of suspicion and clothed in the dignity of widowhood. But revenge, especially one carried out on so public a stage as a throne, does not end when the body is buried. It echoes in the chronicles, in the whispers of survivors, and in the very architecture of memory. Henry IV's death became a story retold so many times that the queen's role was almost erased. Almost, but not entirely. What lingers in the cracks of official history is more revealing than the polished tale placed before posterity. The day of his death was described by chroniclers as a sudden eruption of violence. The assassin penetrated the king's guard, delivered fatal wounds, and was immediately seized. It was a story convenient in its clarity. A single villain, a single act, a single punishment. The assassin was tortured, executed, and his body displayed as proof that justice had been swift. The people were offered a neat narrative they could carry to their hearths. Henry was taken from them by one man's madness, not by the disloyalty of his household or the vengeance of his queen. And yet, when I compare the reports of witnesses, subtle inconsistencies appear. Some say the king collapsed before the blade even pierced deep. Others describe his blood as strangely dark. His flesh weakened as though death had already been waiting in his veins. The assassin was not the beginning of his end. He was the punctuation mark at the close of a sentence already written in the queen's hand. The queen herself emerged from the tragedy with remarkable poise. Her mourning was genuine enough to convince those who wished to be convinced, and dignified enough to silence those who suspected. She wore the veil, she recited the prayers, she accepted condolences with lowered eyes. But beneath the surface, her position had changed entirely. No longer the humiliated wife threatened with dismissal. She was now the royal widow, a figure untouchable in her sorrow. The very factions who had tolerated her revenge now needed her as a symbol of continuity. Her family regained influence at court, her dowry was secured, and her presence became indispensable in the negotiations that followed Henry's death. In one sense, she became more powerful in widowhood than she had ever been as queen. And what of the accomplices? Those silent hands that carried the powders, the linens, the vials? They too were rewarded, though not always openly. The perfumer received new commissions from foreign princesses. The laundresses returned quietly to their parish with small fortunes that no one could explain. The chamber women remained in service, their loyalty cemented by the knowledge that they shared a queen's darkest secret. The physician continued his practice, but his notes after Henry's death became curiously restrained, as if he had learned that too much truth written on paper could one day be used as a noose. All of them became part of a silent fraternity, bound together not by oath but by survival. The assassin, meanwhile, became the perfect scapegoat. His name was etched into chronicles, sermons, and plays as the embodiment of treachery. By elevating his guilt, history erased the queen's. Yet even here, a faint trace of her shadow appears. Why did the assassin find his way so easily into the king's presence? Why were the guards at that moment fewer in number? Why did no one raise an alarm until the blade had already done its work? Too many circumstances aligned for his attack to succeed without resistance. It is difficult not to see invisible hands guiding him, or at least clearing the way. He was both her mask and her instrument, and when he died under torture, he carried her secret with him to the grave. As centuries passed, the story hardened into legend. Official chronicles present Henry as a monarch struck down by a lone fanatic, a victim whose personal failings were washed away by the drama of martyrdom. The queen survives in these records as the grieving widow, not the silent avenger. But when I sift through the fragments, the marginal notes, the hidden receipts, the irregularities in daybooks and ledgers, the true narrative emerges. Henry did not die at once. He was undone in increments. His betrayal of his queen created the conditions for his slow destruction, and her mastery of the invisible arts of household and intimacy transformed that betrayal into a weapon more effective than any sword. What remains is the duality of memory. To the world, the queen was sorrowful, dignified, loyal even in widowhood. To those who can read between the lines, she was patient, calculating, and relentless. She turned the one realm given to women, the bed, into the arena of justice. And in doing so, she left behind a lesson that has unsettled every historian who has dared to uncover it. Power does not always announce itself in armies or decrees. Sometimes it lies in the starch of a pillow, the sweetness of a cordial, the invisible patience of a woman who waits until her enemy falls asleep beside her. Thus ends the tale of Henry IV's death and the queen who avenged herself through the bed. It is not a story of madness, nor of sorcery, nor of chance. It is a story of betrayal answered by betrayal, of conspiracies that thrived in silence, and of revenge that became so perfectly hidden in legend that only the faint scent of it remains, like perfume clinging to linen long after the body has gone. The assassin's blade may be remembered, but it was the queen's hand that truly killed him, and in that knowledge lies the final unvarnished truth.